Good evening, this is Mr. Evans. We are still in Volume 1 of Collier's Junior Classics called ABC Go. We are in Section 2 of that book called Favorite Folk Tales. And the first one tonight is The Three Billy Goats Gruff, retold by Veronica Hutchinson, and the illustrations are by Estelle Hollingworth. Once upon a time there were 3 billy goats, and their name was Gruff. They were going up the mountain to get fat. On their way up, they had to cross a bridge, and under this bridge there lived a troll, with eyes as big as saucers and a nose as long as a broomstick. The billy goats did not know that the troll lived there. First of all came little Billy Goat Gruff. He went trip-trap over the bridge. The troll poked up his head and said, "Who goes trip-trap over my bridge?" The little Billy Goat said, "It is I, little Billy Goat Gruff, and I'm going up the mountain to get fat." "Oh, no, you're not," said the troll, "because I'm going to eat you." "Oh," said little Billy Goat Gruff, "you wouldn't eat me, would you? I am so small. Just wait for my brother, second Billy Goat Gruff, and you eat him. He is much larger than I." "Very well," said the troll, "be off with you." And trip-trap went little Billy Goat Gruff. Presently along came second Billy Goat Gruff, and he went trip-trap over the bridge. The troll poked up his head and said, "Who goes trip-trap over my bridge?" The second Billy Goat Gruff tried to make his voice sound very weak, too, and he said, "It is I, second Billy Goat Gruff, and I'm going up to the mountain to get fat." "Oh, no, you're not," said the troll, "because I'm going to eat you." Then the second Billy Goat said, "Oh, you wouldn't eat me, would you? I am so small. You wait for my brother, great Billy Goat Gruff, and you eat him. He is much larger than I." "Very well, then," said the troll, "be off with you." And trip-trap went second Billy Goat Gruff. Last of all came great Billy Goat Gruff. Oh, he was a great large fellow. His great shaggy fur hung down to his feet. He had 2 large horns coming out of his forehead. When he walked, the bridge just shook. He went trip-trop. Oh, went the bridge, he was so heavy. The troll poked up his head and said, "Who goes trip-trop over my bridge?" The great Billy Goat stood there and said, "It is I, great Billy Goat Gruff, and I'm going up the mountain to get fat." "Oh, no, you're not," said the troll, "because I'm going to eat you." "Come along, then," said the great Billy Goat Gruff, and up came the troll. The great Billy Goat caught him with his 2 horns and tossed him way up in the sky. That was the end of the troll. And trip-trop, away he went over the bridge. By this time the 3 billy goats are so fat that they couldn't come back even though they wanted to. So, snip, snap, snout, my tail is out. Our next story is titled Red Riding Hood by the brothers Grimm, translated by Mrs. E.V. Lucas, Lucy Crane, and Marion Edwards. The illustrations are by Dagmar Wilson. Once upon a time, there was a sweet little maiden who was loved by all who knew her, but she was especially dear to her grandmother, who did not know how to make enough of the child. Once she gave her a little red velvet cloak. It was so becoming, and she liked it so much that she would never wear anything else, and so she got the name of Red Riding Hood. One day her mother said to her, "Come here, Red Riding Hood. Take this cake and bottle of wine to grandmother. She is weak and ill, and they will do her good. Go quickly before it gets hot. And don't loiter by the way, or run, or you will fall down and break the bottle, and there will be no wine for grandmother. When you get there, don't forget to say good morning prettily, without staring about you." I will do just as you tell me, Red Riding Hood promised her mother. Her grandmother lived away in the wood, a good half-hour from the village. When she got to the wood, she met a wolf, but Red Riding Hood did not know what a wicked animal he was, so she was not a bit afraid of him. Good morning, Red Riding Hood, he said. Good morning, Wolf, she answered. Whither away so early, Red Riding Hood? Two grandmothers. What have you got in your basket? Cake and wine. We baked yesterday, so I'm taking a cake to grandmother. She wants something to make her well. Where does your grandmother live, Red Riding Hood? A good quarter of an hour farther into the wood. Her house stands under 3 big oak trees near a hedge of nut trees, which you must know, said Red Riding Hood. The wolf thought, this tender little creature will be a plump morsel. She will be nicer than the old woman. I must be cunning and snap them both up. He walked along with Red Riding Hood for a while. Then he said, Look at the pretty flowers, Red Riding Hood. Why don't you look about you? I don't believe you even hear the birds sing. You are just as solemn as if you were going to school. Everything else is so happy out here in the woods. Red Riding Hood raised her eyes, and when she saw the sunlight dancing through the trees and all the bright flowers, she thought, I'm sure grandmother would be pleased if I took her a bunch of fresh flowers. It is still quite early. I shall have plenty of time to pick them. So she left the path and wandered off among the trees to pick the flowers. Each time she picked one, she always saw another prettier one farther on. So she went deeper and deeper into the forest. In the meantime, the wolf went straight off to the grandmother's cottage and knocked at the door. Who is there? Red Riding Hood bringing you a cake and some wine. Open the door. Lift the latch, called out the woman. I am too weak to get up. The wolf lifted the latch, and the door sprang open. He went straight in and up to the bed without saying a word, and ate up the poor old woman. Then he put on her nightdress and nightcap, got into bed, and drew the curtains. Red Riding Hood ran about picking flowers till she could carry no more, and then she remembered her grandmother again. She was astonished when she got to the house to find the door open, and when she entered the room everything seemed so strange. She felt quite frightened, but she did not know why. Generally, I like coming to see grandmother so much, she thought. Good morning, grandmother, she cried, but she received no answer. Then she went up to bed and drew the curtain back. There lay her grandmother, but she had drawn up her cap down up over her face, and she looked very odd. Oh, grandmother, what big ears you have, she said. The better to hear you with, my dear. Grandmother, what big eyes you have. The better to see you with, my dear. What big hands you have, grandmother. The better to catch hold of you with, my dear. But grandmother, what big teeth you have. The better to eat you up with, my dear. Hardly had the wolf said this than he made a spring out of bed and swallowed poor little Red Riding Hood. When the wolf had satisfied himself, he went back to bed, and he was soon snoring quite loudly. A huntsman went past the house and thought, How loudly the old lady is snoring. I must see if there is anything the matter with her. So he went into the house and up to the bed, where he found the wolf fast asleep. Do I find you here, you old sinner? He said. Long enough have I sought you. He raised his gun to shoot, when it just occurred to him that perhaps the wolf had eaten up the little old lady, and that she still might be saved. So he took a knife and began cutting open the sleeping wolf. At the first cut, he saw the little red cloak, and after a few more slashes, the little girl sprang out and cried, "Oh, how frightened I was! It was so dark inside the wolf." Next, the old grandmother came out, alive, but hardly able to breathe. Red Riding Hood brought some big stones with which they filled the wolf, so that when he woke up and tried to spring away, the stones dragged him back and he fell down dead. They were all quite happy now. The huntsman skinned the wolf and took the skin home. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine which Red Riding Hood had brought, and she soon felt quite strong. Red Riding Hood thought to herself, "I will never again wander off into the forest as long as I live, when my mother forbids it." Our next story is called Cinderella by Charles Perrault, adapted from the Andrew Lang translation, and the illustrations are by William Colrus. Once there was a gentleman who married, for his second wife, the proud and most haughty woman that was ever seen. She had 2 daughters who were exactly like her in all things. He had a young daughter of unparalleled goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. No sooner were the ceremonies of the wedding over, but the mother began to show her bad temper. She could not bear the qualities of this pretty girl, because they made her own daughters appear the more hateful. She employed her in the meanest work of the house, scouring the dishes and tables and scrubbing Madam's room, and also those of her daughters. The girl slept in a sorry garret, upon a wretched straw bed, while her sisters lay in fine rooms, with floors all inlaid, upon beds of the very newest fashion, and where they had looking-glasses so large they might see themselves at full length from head to foot. The poor girl bore all patiently. When she had done her work, she used to go into the chimney corner and sit down among cinders and ashes, which caused her to be called Cinderwench. But the younger, who was not so rude and uncivil as the other, called her Cinderella. However, Cinderella, in spite of her rags, was 100 times prettier than her sisters, though they were always dressed very richly. It happened that the king's son gave a ball, and invited all persons of fashion to it. The 2 sisters were also invited, for they cut a very grand figure among the quality. They were delighted at this invitation, and wonderfully busy in choosing such gowns, petticoats, and headdresses as might become them. This was a new trouble to Cinderella, for it was she who ironed her sisters' linen and plaited their ruffles, while they talked all day long of nothing but how they should be dressed. "For my part," said the elder, "I will wear my red velvet suit with French trimming." "And I," said the younger, "shall have my usual petticoat. But then, to make amends for that, I will put on my gold-flowered cloak and my diamond ornament, which is far from being the most ordinary one in the world." They sent for the best lady's maid they could get to make up their headdresses and adjust their double pinners, and they had their red brushes and patches from Mademoiselle de la Poche. Cinderella was likewise consulted in all these matters, for she had excellent notions, and advised them always for the best, and offered her services to dress their hair, which they were very willing she should do. As she was doing this, they said to her, "Cinderella, would you not like to go to the ball?" "Alas," she said, "you only make fun of me. It is not for such as I to go there." "You are in the right of it," replied they. "It would certainly make people laugh to see a Cinderwench at a palace ball." Anyone but Cinderella would have fixed their hair badly, but she was very good, and dressed them perfectly. They went almost 2 days without eating, they were so happy. They broke above a dozen of laces in trying to be laced up close, that they might have a fine slender shape, and they were continually looking at their glass. At last the happy day came. They went to court, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as long as she could, and when she had lost sight of them, she fell a-crying. Her godmother, who saw her all in tears, asked her what was the matter. I wish I could. She was not able to speak the rest, being interrupted by her tears and sobbing. This godmother of hers, who was a fairy, said to her, "You wish to go to the ball, is it not so?" "Yes," cried Cinderella with a great sigh. "Well," said her godmother, "be a good girl, and I will try to help you go." Then she said to her, "Run into the garden and bring me a pumpkin." Cinderella went immediately to gather the finest one and brought it to her godmother, not being able to imagine how this pumpkin could make her go to the ball. Her godmother scooped out all the inside of it, leaving nothing but the rind, which done, she struck it with her wand, and the pumpkin was instantly turned into a fine coach, gilded all over with gold. She then went to look in her mouse trap, where she found 6 mice, all alive. She told Cinderella to lift up the little trap door, when, giving each mouse as it went out a little tap with her wand, the mouse was that moment turned into a fine horse. Altogether they made a very fine set of 6 horses of a beautiful mouse-colored gray. Being at a loss for a coachman, Cinderella said, "I will go and see if there is a rat in the rat trap. We may make a coachman of him." "You are right," replied her godmother. "Go and look." Cinderella brought the trap to her, and in it there were 3 huge rats. The fairy chose the one which had the largest beard, and having touched him with her wand, he was turned into a fat, jolly coachman, who had the smartest whiskers eyes ever beheld. After that she said to her, "Go again into the garden. You will find 6 lizards behind the watering pot. Bring them to me." Cinderella had no sooner done so than her godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who skipped up immediately behind the coach, with their liveries all covered with gold and silver. They clung as close behind each other as if they had done nothing else their whole lives. The fairy then said to Cinderella, "Well, you see here carriage and horses and footmen fit to take you to the ball. Are you not pleased with it?" "Oh, yes," cried Cinderella. "But must I go there as I am, in these old rags?" Her godmother just touched her with her wand, and at the same instant her clothes were turned into cloth of gold and silver, all beset with jewels. This done, she gave her a pair of glass slippers, the prettiest in the whole world. Being thus decked out, Cinderella climbed into her coach, but her godmother, above all things, commanded her not to stay till after midnight, telling her at the same time that if she stayed 1 moment longer, the coach would be a pumpkin again, her horses mice, her coachman a rat, her footmen lizards, and her clothes would become just as they were before. Cinderella promised her godmother she would not fail to leave the ball before midnight, and then away she drove, scarce able to contain herself for joy. The king's son, who was told that a great princess, whom nobody knew, had come, ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand as she alighted from the coach, and led her into the hall among all the company. There was immediate silence. They left off dancing, and the violins ceased to play, so eager was everyone to look at the singular beauties of the unknown newcomer. Nothing was heard but a confused noise of, "How pretty she is! How pretty she is!" The king himself, old as he was, could not help but watching her and telling the queen softly that it was a long time since he had seen so beautiful and lovely a creature. All the ladies were busied in considering her clothes and headdress, that they might have some made next day after the same pattern, provided they could meet with such fine materials and find able hands to make them. The king's son conducted her to the most honorable seat, and afterward took her out to dance with him, and she danced so gracefully that all more and more admired her. Fine refreshments were served, of which the young prince ate not a morsel, so intently was he gazing on Cinderella. She sat down by her sisters, showing them 1,000 civilities, giving them part of the oranges and citrons which the prince had presented her, which very much surprised them, for they did not know her. While Cinderella was thus amusing her sisters, she heard the clock strike 11 3/4, whereupon she immediately made a curtsy to the company and hastened away as fast as she could. Reaching home, she ran to seek out her godmother, and, after having thanked her, said she could not but heartily wish she might go next day to the ball, because the king's son had asked her. As she was eagerly telling her godmother whatever had passed at the ball, her two sisters knocked at the door, which Cinderella ran and opened. "How long you have stayed!" cried she, rubbing her eyes, and stretching herself as if she had just been waked out of her sleep. She had not, however, had any inclination to sleep since they went from home. "If you had been at the ball," said one of her sisters, "you would not have been tired with it. There we met the finest princess, the most beautiful ever seen with mortal eyes. She showed us 1,000 civilities and gave us oranges and citrons." Cinderella seemed very indifferent in the matter, but asked them the name of the princess. They told her they did not know it, and that the king's son would give all the world to know who she was. At this, Cinderella, smiling, replied, "She must then be very beautiful indeed. How happy you have been! Could I not see her? Ah, dear Miss Charlotte, do lend me your yellow clothes which you wear every day." "Ay, to be sure," cried Miss Charlotte. "Lend my clothes to a dirty cinder-wench? I should be a fool." Cinderella expected such an answer, and was very glad of the refusal, for she would have been sadly put to it if her sister had done what she asked for jestingly. The next day the two sisters were at the ball, and so was Cinderella, but dressed more magnificently than before. The king's son was always by her, and never ceased his compliments and kind speeches to her. All this was so far from being tiresome, that she quite forgot what her grandmother had commanded her. At last she counted the clock striking 12, when she took it to be no more than 11. She then rose up and fled, as nimble as a deer. The prince followed, but could not overtake her. She left behind one of her glass slippers, which the prince took up most carefully. Cinderella reached home, quite out of breath, and in her old clothes, having nothing left of all her finery but one of the little slippers, the mate to the one she had dropped. The guards at the palace gate were asked if they had not seen a princess go out. They had seen nobody but a young girl, very meanly dressed, who had more the air of a poor country wench than a gentlewoman. When the two sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had been well entertained, and if the fine lady had been there. They told her yes, but that she hurried away immediately when it struck 12, and with so much haste that she dropped one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world. The king's son had taken it up. He had done nothing but look at her all the time at the ball, and most certainly he was very much in love with the beautiful girl who owned the glass slipper. What they said was very true, for a few days afterward the king's son proclaimed by sound of trumpet that he would marry the girl whose foot this slipper would just fit. His servants began to try it upon the princesses, then the duchesses, and then all the court, but in vain. It was brought to the two sisters, who each did all she possibly could to thrust her foot into the slipper, but they could not put on the slipper. Cinderella, who saw all this and knew her slipper, said to them, laughing, "Let me see if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out laughing and began to banter her. The gentleman who was sent to try the slipper looked earnestly at Cinderella, and finding her very handsome, said it was only fair that she should try, and that he had orders to let everyone make the attempt. He obliged Cinderella to sit down, and putting the slipper to her foot, he found it went on easily and fitted her as if it had been made of wax. The astonishment of her two sisters was great, but still greater when Cinderella pulled out of her pocket the other slipper and put it on her foot. At that moment in came her godmother with her At that moment in came her godmother, who, having touched Cinderella's clothes with her wand, made them richer and more magnificent than any she had worn before. And now her two sisters found her to be that fine, beautiful lady they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all the ill treatment they had made her undergo. Cinderella raised them up, and as she embraced them, cried that she forgave them with all her heart and desired them always to love her. She was conducted to the young prince. He thought her more charming than ever, and a few days after married her. Cinderella, who was no less good than beautiful, gave her two sisters lodgings in the palace, and that very same day matched them with two great lords of the court. That is the end of our reading for this evening. I will see you again tomorrow night.